Welcome back, everybody, to this fragment on Simmelian numbers. There's been a lot of talk in some online quarters about the importance of organization. A point is raised, taken from elite theory, that in modern mass societies, power lies in the hands of the organized few rather than the disorganized many. Well, if organization is such an important topic, one might think that sociology, being the study of human social organization, might have something to offer. And indeed, if we go back in time, in this case to the early 20th century, we find that it does have something to offer. In this video, we're going to look at some insights which can be gleaned from sociology. Simmelian numbers are named after the Jewish-Prussian sociologist Georg Simmel, who was born in Berlin in 1858. He published an essay in 1908 on the significance of numbers in social life, from which some of the main observations in this fragment have been drawn. Simmel has an interesting life history, which we don't have time to get into here, but you can look at it for yourself. Now, the first significant number for Simmel is 3. This is the number, according to his reckoning, that represents the beginning of social life. It's the lowest possible number for a group, for group dynamics, that is, social dynamics. 2 people creates a one-on-one relationship which has different dynamics from the dynamics of society as we know it. And I think that's a very important point. It's certainly a crucial point for Simmel. Now, the reason why 3 is the fundamental beginnings of a group dynamic, there are several reasons, but I can highlight a couple right now. One is that 3 is the number at which no individual has the power to destroy the group. Because if there's 2 people, one person leaves the relationship ends. But if there's 3, one person leaves, some relationship still exists. So the individual does not have the power to destroy the group, which is significant. And then the other factor is that with 3 people, the possibility of coalitions, 2 against 1 or 2 over versus 1, not necessarily against, in a military sense, but there is some kind of coalition of 2 on 1. That is a social arrangement which isn't possible with only 2 people, but it's also a social arrangement that's fundamental to how human beings organize themselves with others. It's also fundamental for the imposition of group dynamics. We're all familiar now with the fact that people like to go along with a group to get along. The psychology at work in that takes place when there are 3 or more people operating. It doesn't really take place. It's just a one-on-one situation. This has some very interesting implications for us. One implication is that this is a minimum number at which one should seek to organize if one wishes to accomplish something, whether that's locally or on a larger scale. You're going to find more success if you can get group dynamics into play. I'll give you an example. Think about creating a group to an exercise group in which individuals join together, and we're going to encourage each other to exercise. That group is going to have more success if it's a group of 3 rather than 1 or 2. One reason for this would be that, well, in a group of 3, you have obligations that you can't just erase by leaving. That is, well, if you can erase them for yourself, but the relationship would still exist. But also there's the possibility of a coalition. Let's say you don't want to work out that day. The other 2 can band together and say, hey, man, we agreed to do this together. Why don't you come along with us? And then there is that added pressure of, oh, well, I owe this to the group, right? Rather than I owe this to myself. You owe it to yourself. Yes, that individual drive is still there. But there's also a group drive that can keep you motivated. And that can be effective. That can be effective in driving change. Another implication of this that occurred to me is that this might be an explanation of the appeal of libertarianism for some people. For example, we know that libertarianism appeals to men, and it also appeals more specifically to autistics. Not that everyone who is libertarian is autistic, but that it is, let's say, they're overrepresented among libertarians. But one reason for this might be that libertarianism, by trying to maximize or trying to see society in a maximal way as composed of transactional relationships, that is, one-on-one relationships. Part of the advantage of that is that it simplifies the complexity of human life. If we can reduce human life to transactions, a series of transactions, that's just one-on-one things. Those operate according to simpler rules, according to Simmel, according to sociology. The rules being simpler, they're easier to understand. Autistic people in particular have difficulty picking up on subtle, unwritten rules of society. And it can be more comforting to see society as, well, it's just governed by these easy to understand relationships. And men also in particular men have an independent streak. It's part of the male need to climb hierarchies of dominance to establish oneself. And so men can be less adapted socially. They have to be made to adapt in a way. The old saying is that girls blossom into women, but boys are built into men. But we also see why libertarianism fails. It fails because human beings do have this social dimension. There is usually a third factor or more. Most relationships can't really be broken down to one-on-one or transactional relationships. So it's not going to work just for that simple numerical reason. Most human relationships exist in a world beyond two. The next significant number is actually a range, and that's the range from 7 to 10. This number for Simmel represents the upper limit of group informality, meaning the limit at which a group can be engaged in the same conversation and all are participating in that conversation. Any more than this, and one of two things will happen. Either the conversation and the groups will splinter. Think of a party where if there's 20, 30 people at the party, usually you will find these people gathered together in groups of 2, 3, or 4. And they may split off and move in between these groups during the course of the party, but by and large, these groups of this size will coalesce together. It's a splintering of one conversation. It's rarely going to be 20, 30 people at a party all gathered around a table talking about the same thing. That's basically impossible. Or the other thing that could happen is that the conversation will become more formal. Think about an awards banquet or a classroom situation where, okay, there is one conversation, but usually it's one conversation dominated by a single speaker. There was a trend some years back, I don't know if it's still happening, but there was a trend some years back where teachers would try to turn their classroom into an informal situation where they would sit among the students to sort of reduce the idea of like a hierarchy where there's a teacher at the center. But the problem with this is that that's a fight against a sociological fact, which is that in that classroom situation, there's just too many people for it to really be an informal conversation. It has to be formal. There has to be one person in charge. That's just the way it's going to be. And in fact, in classrooms where I tried to make this work, or where I saw people trying to make this work, usually it would devolve into little groups, or it would be a somewhat rotating formality, where there'd be a teacher who would be at the center, and then a student would be at the center for a while. But I don't know that this was really accepted or enjoyed by the participants. So you can think about 7 to 10. One of the implications for this number is that this is a good number for basic political action. If you want to organize locally, you can start to think about trying to organize a cell or a group of at least 3, meaning 2 other people, but up to around 7 to 10. Whether your goal is to get somebody elected, change an ordinance, or maybe alter some policy at work, that's a good number for political action. Why is that? Well, because that number, if you're within that number, you have the possibility of informal but mutual discussion, meaning there's an organization, there's a group in which all can participate and all can be aware at the same time of what your goal is, what your aim is. Now, obviously, to accomplish greater goals, you need more people. But for more people, the organization will have to take on a different character. We'll look at that in a couple of minutes. But if you want to do something locally, I think shooting for a cell of around 3 to 10 people is probably a good idea. Another reason why that's a good number is because it makes possible informal single conversations in which all participate, you can build up friendly bonds among a group of about that size. I mean, there's reasons why military squads often operate in units of about this number, around this number. And there's reasons why work teams are often built around this number. Okay, these are just effective little organizing units. You can think about them as little basic units of organization, basic groups, or basic human groups as they tend to emerge. Now, the next interesting number is the number 12. So I talked about organizing larger groups. Well, one of the first numbers for thinking about organizing in larger groups is 12. And that number is about the upper limit for persons with whom one can have a close and direct personal bond. So usually, if you're going to have close friends, the number might be fewer. In my case, it certainly is. I don't think I have 12 close friends. But you probably can't have more than this, just because there isn't enough time in the day to devote to each person such that each one would feel, I have a direct personal bond with this person. They would mutually feel, this is my close personal friend. So this is about the upper limit. Now, if you have a teaching you want to impart, or a philosophy you want to spread, or a religion you want to spread, or a group you want to organize, basically, you want to start delegating out authority, delegating out influence to this personal cadre, right? You would have to operate through these people. They become nodes within a network, right? And so if there is a large group that you want to organize, you can think in terms, let's say you have a business and you want your business to expand. Well, you would develop a core of people that you can trust, and then you would delegate to that core of up to about 12 the responsibility for hiring and training and taking care of new people. You're not going to be able to do that. Like, you might meet them and know them a little bit, but they're not going to be part of your basic core. Okay. And the reason why that number is important is because there is another range that's significant, the range of 65 to 70. And that's the range at which something like a personal cult, that is a cult in which one person leads a group. They don't delegate, they don't select, as Jesus selected his 12 disciples. There's a reason for that 12 disciples, right? A sociological reason as well as other reasons. If you don't select that, then basically your group can't grow beyond this number, right? Because, and there's the reasons for this aren't exactly understood, but that seems to be about the limit of what the personal magnetism of one person can hold on to, right? Yeah, it could go a little bit beyond that, or maybe it'll be a little less than that for other individuals, but around this range is the number at which we see cults in which there is really one leader, one focal point, start to implode. The groups can't expand anymore, and so they kind of turn in on themselves, and in turning in on themselves, they often create problems for themselves, friction with whatever local community they exist within. An example would be David Koresh, his group, where got up to about 80, and then they ran afoul of the FBI. Not necessarily saying that they did anything wrong, but certainly the group couldn't necessarily grow beyond that, and they did run into problems. And then another example would be something like the Heaven's Gate cult, the people who committed suicide together. That was about 60 people at its height. And interestingly, at one point there were sort of two cult leaders. One of them got cancer and died, and it was a couple of years after that. They'd been going as a cult for I think a few decades at that point, and it was only a few years after her death that they collapsed completely and sort of went to their and killed themselves. If you want to organize a large group and you want that group to survive, you don't want that group to implode, then you want it to grow beyond 65, 70, then you have to start delegating. You have to start finding a trusted and select few who can carry it on. Disciples who can carry on the message, as we see in the book of Acts, where the early disciples began to carry on and spread the message of Jesus after his death and resurrection. Now, the last interesting number that I want to talk about is a group-on-group number, and that's the number 2. And one interesting observation that we can draw from sociology and from history is that in kinetic situations, in conflict, especially violent conflict, but also in political situations which are either extreme or drawing close to violent conflict, what you'll see is that human groups will resolve into 2. That is, wars usually take place between 2. If it's multiple nations, the nations will coalesce into alliances, even if those alliances are sort of loose, like the Allies in World War II. Nevertheless, they work together, they coordinate. They're not fighting each other. Now, the reasons for this also aren't exactly understood, but it's certainly safer if you're involved in actually a violent situation to have one other enemy rather than more than one other enemy. Now, this has interesting implications. One implication is that if you are foreseeing a conflict situation arising, then basically the mentality of people is going to be to pick a side. Okay? Now, that side could be, well, I want to remain neutral. Okay, you're not involved in the conflict. In many cases, you can get away with this. However, there is also the phenomenon that when human beings are involved in violent conflict, sometimes they will look upon neutrals as an enemy to be destroyed as well. And this is a situation that Thucydides described when he talked about the civil war at Corcyra. So during that civil war, he noted the neutrals ended up being destroyed by both of the parties who were allied against him. The Democratic faction and the aristocratic faction destroyed the neutrals because neither of them could trust them. Or as he puts it, on the one hand, they hated them because they wouldn't help them out, and on the other hand, they envied them that they should try to escape from the civil conflict by saying, well, I'm neutral. And so they couldn't tolerate either thing, either that they wouldn't be assisted or that they would avoid the conflict that they were within. And so the neutrals were destroyed. But you also have the phenomena of World War II, where several countries which proclaimed neutrality were invaded, some by the Axis powers, some by the Allied powers. The point being that their neutrality was not always respected. So it isn't always an option to just say, well, I'm not going to pick a side, even though many of us would prefer to do so. Another way this is relevant is that we can use this as it's not an absolute, but we can use this as a hint or a predictor of future events. Are events likely to become kinetic, or are they likely to come to a major political crisis? Not necessarily an outbreak of violence, but a serious political crisis in which serious decisions have to be made. Well, one way of determining that would be to see if the sides, and usually there's many sides in conflicts, are the sides resolving into 2 recognizable factions. And if they are, then I would say that that's a likely predictor that it is going to move in that direction. And the reason why is because people are choosing sides. They wouldn't be doing so if they didn't sense that, or if they didn't intend that. And even if they don't intend that, by doing so, it also makes it more likely. Okay, so if you're in a situation where you're starting to see sides resolving into two, you might be moving in towards a violent outbreak or towards a serious crisis. I hope these numbers have been of some interest. Bye for now.